Welcome, Left Reckoners. Flying solo today is Matt Leck. And joining me now is Heidi Matthews and Tanya Serisier. Heidi is an assistant professor at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University in Toronto. She researches and teaches in areas of international law, criminal law and sexuality. Tanya Serisier is a reader in feminist theory at the School of Social Sciences, Birkbeck College, University of London. She writes and publishes on the cultural politics of sexuality and sexual violence. Thank you both for being here. This is a topic that we've covered in the context of the Ukraine conflict with Lily Lynch. But I just want to give you both an opportunity to talk about sexual violence, both as a justification for continuing the context of war, and also setting the context for war, setting the context for sexual assault.
Do you want to start, Heidi?
So when we talked the last time we did a joint interview, the host kind of directed questions to one of us or the other. So you can do that, Matt, or we can just kind of chat. I think.
Okay, yeah, Tanya. How about? Yeah, actually, I did listen to that interview. So Tanya, I guess in my imagination, it was starting with you. So I will take that role, and I'll direct that question to you first.
All right, so about sexual violence as a justification for war. I mean, it's interesting because I was in a talk today with a friend of mine who works on this, and in the article, we talk about the history in the 20th century of sexual violence being used as a justification for war. But this colleague of mine was talking about how you see it in ancient Greece, in Rome, but you really see it post kind of urbanization, industrialization, and when you get both what we would see as kind of conventional types of sexism today and also racial vilification, you know, this discourse of kind of the barbarians at the gates. And I think that's the important thing. And I'll hand over to Heidi in a second, who can give some really specific examples from the 20th century. But I think sometimes we talk about these things as though they're just abstract or general. You know, we use sexual violence as a justification for war, but we only use it selectively, you know, and it's only when it's tied to other discourses, mainly around kind of civilization and race, that it gets used in that way. So, you know, no one, despite the fact that we know that in many of the cases where, for instance, the US has military bases, there have been many allegations of sexual violence. No one has ever expected anyone to go to war against the US, you know, because of that. And I could say the same thing about the UK. So I think we have to, you know, we have to be careful when we talk about this, that part of the problem is we abstract it, and actually we're always talking about sexual violence in the context of geopolitics, in the context of racial politics, and in the context of these kinds of discourses, which enable us to see, you know, in this case, Palestinian Arab men as sexually violent in a way that justifies, you know, an assault on an entire people, including women and children. So.
Yeah. Maybe I will actually just kind of jump in, I suppose, and riff off what Tanya's just said so nicely. Yeah, I mean, just really briefly, from an international legal perspective as well, you know, if you go back to kind of the turn of the century before last, I guess the thing we used to call the turn of the century, so the late 19th century, early 20th century, when we see the emergence of what we now understand as you know, official attempts through multilateral treaty making, et cetera, to sort of set the rules of war, as it were. Like, even those attempts included prohibitions on the use of rape, you know, as a weapon of war, is kind of the language we often hear. You know, that was outlawed a really long time ago. Making that a war crime is not a new thing, right? That's something that the world has paid attention to for a long time. But even in that context, exactly as Tanya says, in reality, what we're concerned with is the violation of white women, right? And we see that as well when we look at early efforts in the early 20th century around sexual slavery and trafficking also. So yeah, many examples, of course, we can talk about, but I think the key point from our piece is the way in which the weaponized, like the sort of ideas about what we can and can't do legally and morally in war intersect, almost every single time with ideas about civilization, white women's victimization, or correlatively savior, and clearly ideas about civilization, colonization, and race.
Yeah, and you mentioned the different incidents which have been brought to the attention of, like, Christine Amanpour, of a Palestinian boy being reported as sexually assaulted, and it's like, which ones do we really hear about and become grist for Congress to start talking about? So we hear Israel talking about the Hamas rapist regime and using rape as a weapon of war. And you guys don't get too deep into the evidence for that in the piece. It's more a broader, what the context of this is. I'm just curious, like, the Hamas rapist regime, when people see that term deployed, how would you contextualize it? Heidi, we'll start with you this time.
You'll have to just call us like we're in class or something, like a reverse move here. Yeah. The Hamas, I mean, like, so this is very clearly, like a propagandist kind of term of art. We see this coming out of one of my favorite figures on Twitter right now, Elon Levy. He's a spokesperson for the Israeli government, and just kind of coined this term and keeps repeating it. And then, of course, it filters down through the regular Hezbollah channels, right? So this is an effort to construct, I mean, Hamas in particular, but I think, it's pretty clear that the broader implication is that it's a construction of, like, the Palestinian people as a people, as being, composed of, subjugated women, number one, right? Being led by men who have the goal of not just running around raping, but I think running around doing sexual violence on, here constructed as white, Jewish Israeli women, and right. So, like, the worst possible outcome, or kind of thing that could happen, like perhaps even worse than, breaching, like, the border or the fence, right? Encircling and imprisoning Palestinians in Gaza, even worse than doing that, I think, which is something we really actually don't talk about much at all. We're very much focused on the atrocity story. Even worse than that, right, is the fact that white Israeli women were victimized or violated, right? So it's that border of kind of white femininity, and the Jewish woman here that is being presented, I think, as being the thing that's really being violated and that's being avenged quite openly.
And does it seem like a little bit compensatory? Like, the accusation that Hamas is using rape as a weapon of war. Israel is currently using starvation as a weapon of war, and, like, I feel like maybe it's a little bit too cynical, but I'll editorialize here that you need a accusation like this to mask what you are doing in your own front. But we have Sheryl Sandberg speaking, I believe, at the UN. That was
silence is complicity. And in the face of terror, we cannot be quiet. That is why we are all here today, to speak about unspeakable acts. On October 7th, Hamas brutally murdered 1,200 souls. And in some cases, they first raped their victims. We know this from eyewitnesses. We know this from combat paramedics. We would know this from some victims if more had been allowed to live. Maybe then one would be standing beside me right here to state something that should not need to be stated. Rape should never be used as an act of war.
Deploying this feminism, and we're in, like, a post-Me Too context, and Zionists are aware of that, evidently. So, and Tanya, can you just talk to that, like, our post-Me Too context and how Israel and supporters are using it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been very deliberate on Israel's part, and one of the things we see, and sorry, I'm not usually this husky, but I've had a really bad cold. So if my voice goes strange, that's why. In the lead up to that event, the Hear Our Voices event that Sheryl Sandberg and other people spoke at, Israel launched what you can only see as basically a kind of a mass public relations effort to try to quite clearly, I think, instrumentalize that kind of post-Me Too language. And I think one of the most obvious examples of that is a video that came out about a week before, and it was released on the Israeli government's X account, as well as elsewhere. And it's a fictional video where, with actors, it's very high production values. A young woman runs into this office that has a logo that looks like the UN logo, says Global Police Force, and the office is completely staffed by women wearing T-shirts that say things like "Believe Women," believe survivors. And she starts talking about being raped, and it's clearly, she's talking about the music festival on October the 7th. And she goes on, and eventually the women stop her and they say, "Oh, are you Israeli? And was the man Palestinian?" And she says, "Yes, yes." And they say, "Oh, we can't help you. It's nothing personal, but we have orders from upstairs that any sexual violence committed by any Palestinian against an Israeli is legitimate resistance." And that's almost a direct quote. And, and that's where you get, at the same time, the beginning of a lot of media stories coming out, a campaign, #MeToo unless you're a Jew, believe Israeli women. And the context that, the narrative that's being deployed here is almost, Me Too has been successful for everyone except for us, that we care about, and sexual violence, except if it happens, to Jewish women. And so there's this idea, that what's happening is a mass hypocrisy, and it goes alongside then this idea, I think, two things. The first is, that, as you said, if we talk about sexual violence, that means nothing else matters. It doesn't matter about starvation. It doesn't matter even about the killing of children, because sexual violence is this one thing that's so horrific that we all have to oppose it. But then on the other hand, you see this very, I think, quite insidious slippage between, believe Israeli women and what we say in the article, believe the IDF or believe Benjamin Netanyahu. That actually it means not only that we should listen to women, and I think that has been, we can be critical about the politics of Me Too, but there's an important context where women speaking about what's being done to them has been denied and disbelieved. But also, and we say this in the article, another part of that is that people have spoken about women and their victimization and their bodies and used it for other ends, for centuries. So doing that, is not a form of feminism, but it's an attempt to kind of do this slippage of saying, believe Israeli women, actually, believe anything Benjamin Netanyahu says, believe Elon Levy. You don't need survivors, because you just need these people who can claim to speak on their behalf. And then I think the other element, which I think is where both of us would be kind of more critical of Me Too, is what's been missing from the conversation is, then what do we do? If we want to take sexual violence seriously, one strand of feminism that often gets called carceral feminism now, is in a domestic context. If we take it seriously, we build more prisons, we lock people up, and that's going to solve the problem. And if you translate that to the international sphere, you can see that logic of punitivism. Well, we just go to war, we bomb people. And there's a real question there around, in what way does that provide any kind of justice to any victim of violence, on October the 7th? How does it allow for justice for victims of sexual violence in Palestine as well, but even in Israel,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the key slippage that has been maddening over the course of these months, is not just victims of sexual violence on October 7th, but the hostages in general. How do we actually benefit them and seek justice for atrocities committed? And somehow there's been a sort of acceptance that bombing is one of the acceptable answers to that. And I guess for anybody concerned, what would an actual, if you could have dictated the world response to October 7th, what would that have been, Heidi?
Great. Heidi's a much better global dictator than me. So.
Got my hat on. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks, Matt. Well, I mean, like, just to quickly riff off a part of what Tanya said as well, like with respect to the discourse around the hostages, and this goes into your question about like, well, what actually do we do in this, persistent, catastrophic situation? It's catastrophic for Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but all over the occupied Palestinian territory, but also for the hostages that remain. Obviously, it's a horrible catastrophe. We'll repeat, it is a war crime, needs to be dealt with, etc. And I think what we're seeing, though, too, is this whipping up of the public imagination around the specter or possibility of sexual violence being perpetrated against the hostages currently, right? Mm-hmm. With like very little to no actual evidence, right? And not to say that it's not happening. Neither Tanya or I is in a position to say whether hostages have been sexually victimized. That's emphatically not the point of our intervention, right? The point of the intervention is to say that the specter of that victimization is being used to do exactly what you've just described, which is to continue the massively disproportionate, indiscriminate, bombing campaign and what is, devolved into an actual genocide in Gaza. So, even Tanya and I were talking yesterday, and I looked at the BBC, I think it was the BBC, what used to have an actually pretty reliable kind of live, regularly updated like ticker about news on the war in Gaza, which has now completely disappeared. And the only thing on the entire BBC like homepage referencing Gaza at all was this story about a father worrying that his daughter was being raped as a hostage in Gaza, right? So that's the point that we've kind of arrived at in terms of the discourse. Now, what would we do? I mean, this is a big question. I mean, we need to end the occupation. We need to create a path for Palestinians where their inherent right to self-determination is recognized as existing and in need of international enforcement. And we need to stop the genocide.
Yeah, and there's a couple things. First is just the usefulness that powers find atrocities for propaganda. I'm from North Dakota, and learning about the removal of the Dakotas from Minnesota during the Civil War, we hear a lot about what was done in the uprising. We didn't hear it. It took like later study for me to find out about like the relationship they had with traders and starvation that was going on those things, right? And that has obscured, I mean, to this day, our understanding of our own history here. I also want to give Heidi a chance because I forgot what sort of brought all this to my attention, which wasn't just, the article on Counterpunch, which we'll link to, but you getting into it with David Frum, the spokesperson for the war on terror in the Bush administration on Twitter. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to David Frum, because I think you were right on the money with your original tweets on this article. And just what's it like to be singled out by a guy who should probably, get some ICJ attention himself?
Or ICC, but
right, yes.
Just to be pedantic. And I would just say on the question of colonial genocide and Indigenous peoples, I'm Canadian and Tanya is Australian, so we have quite a bit of like regional expertise on this call with respect to being settlers and reckoning with history and all of that stuff as well, and something that David Frum as a fellow Canadian should spend a little bit more time doing along with Linda Frum, who I also sometimes talk to on Twitter. So I don't know. I mean, whatever. Like the original tweet was this idea about sex exceptionalism, right? And just to say that, yes, obviously sexual violence in conflict is a war crime and may, depending on the circumstances, amount as well to a crime against humanity. But what we're seeing is sex exceptionalism kind of as a way of, it's a theory, I suppose, a way of making sense of the way we talk about sex, sexuality, and sexual violation in order to achieve certain political purposes without looking like we're trying to achieve political purposes, right? So the whole beauty of atrocity-focused discourse in general, and this is not unique to sexual violence, but is certainly, I think, intensified in that realm. The whole kind of beauty, especially for liberal legalists, around atrocity language is that it just takes the whole question of politics off the table, right? You don't need to talk about, why people might have grievances and be behaving in, very damaging and possibly criminal ways. Like that's the whole point of the discourse. And so, whatever. I mean, David from just like cut my tweet in half and got mad about the idea of sex exceptionalism. But I actually think that Tanya I would love to hear what she has to say about kind of the frame, why it is that sex exceptionalism as a frame got tons of people really, really, really upset. Like I ended up being in like the Daily Wire, which was a point of pride as well. Like it was in multiple, the National Post, the right wing, newspaper in Canada. Like lots of folks actually got super up in arms with the use of that language in the first place. And that's something that still puzzles me.
Are you asking me to come in here?
Sorry, I'm not the one. I'm not supposed to be asking questions here, but I really do.
No.
I mean, yeah, I'd be curious what you thought on that too, because it really did strike a nerve with those folks.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really. I think it is really hard. It's in a way it's puzzling, but it just shows how. I think it just shows kind of, to be very banal in a way, how entrenched the idea actually is. And I think there's been a really selective take-up of particular aspects of feminist culture and feminist ideas amongst liberal elites in the West. And, and we can talk about Sheryl Sandberg in a lot of ways with that. But I think, the being horrified about spectacular cases of sexual violence, stranger rape in conflict has become one of the things that we think of as defining kind of reasonable people. It's almost become like a feature of, and you see it in terms of Western civilization and civilizational discourse now. We are the people who are horrified by rape, and that's what makes us the good people. That's what makes us essentially the kind of justified, feminist leaders of the world. And I think, then when you use the argument of sex exceptionalism, on the one hand, which I think doesn't even come into the responses a lot of the time, but what you're saying is, you kind of parading your horror at these very particular examples of sexual violence doesn't make you a good person who should be invading other places, but they also get to kind of double down on that and reperform it and say, well, what, who are the left? The left are people who don't care about sexual violence,
Right.
Yeah.
which I think is another political move. And you see it in, all those kinds of, articles that came out, because it's the other side of saying, rape is rape, and because I remember there was one reply to that tweet, and that tweet was actually how we started writing the article together, because I think we'd both been watching what was happening with this discourse kind of in horror. And I tend to watch what happens on Twitter in horror as well and not do very much. But and so then I saw Heidi's tweet in the response, and I messaged her and was like, are you going to write something? Because I've been thinking of it. And we ended up doing it, but one reply to the tweet was like, it was something like, if you ever have the words rape and butt in a sentence, you're a terrible person, and it is that. It's that idea that in very particular circumstances, just wielding this term should shut down politics, it should shut down any kind of debate, and I think what's important there is not only that it's the term, but it's the term deployed in specific circumstances. And I wanted to come in back a while ago when we were talking about evidence, to say that I think the question of evidence is really secondary, because, you mentioned the Josh Paul interview on CNN with Christiane Amanpour. There's a whole bunch of evidence of sexual violence committed by Israeli forces against Palestinians in detention before this conflict, during this conflict. The evidence is there. It's not contested. The question, the difference is it doesn't matter to people. And this is what Josh Paul said in the interview. The State Department thought that this was credible. And for your listeners who don't know, they were reviewing arms sales to Israel. A Palestinian charity contacted them and said, we have this evidence that a young boy, 13 years old, was raped while held in detention by the IDF. The State Department investigated, and I don't know what they did, but they found the allegations to be credible. They decided that it wasn't going to stop them from selling arms. This is around the time. It was one of the main things that made Paul resign. But what was so striking to me as well was this interview came out on one of the biggest forums in American media at a time when everyone was apparently, horrified beyond belief at sexual violence in conflict. No one ever contradicted Paul as far as I know. But the interview just kind of went out into the world and there was no response. Right. The evidence. So I think whenever we talk about evidence, we actually always have to say the question is what matters, because there's a lot of evidence of sexual violence preceding this conflict. There's a lot of evidence of sexual violence in the occupation of Gaza, the siege of Gaza, and it is not allowed to matter in the same way. As Heidi said, these specters, instead what matters is someone is worried that someone might have sexual violence committed against them, where they're Israeli. And we know that we've seen, sorry, it really, in a way I kind of have my own, I suppose, faux liberal outrage, but we've seen the videos, we've seen the testimonies coming from women, men, boys in Gaza. We know that in the months since October the 7th, sexual violence has been committed in plain sight, has been filmed, has been distributed on social media. There's no lack of evidence, but nobody thinks that the Israeli armed forces, the Israeli government, let alone the Israeli people, which is what's happening to the people of Gaza, should be in any way held to account for that. And that's what I just think, I think that people get so angry because it's a very, it's a very kind of fragile but also deeply held investment. And so that was a very long ramble. But. No,
that was interesting. And one of the things that made me think of is kind of relatedly, and kind of how I think some of the more cynical deployers of maybe the sex exceptionalist, the people who reacted strong to Heidi, they see these social justice issues as not really vehicles towards justice, but vehicles towards empowerment and popular mobilization. And so you saw certain supporters of Israel early on being like, hey, I was marching with BLM. Why aren't you supporting us as Israel bombs Gaza? And it's almost like, I think some people actually don't understand why, and other people just realize, hey, I put the time in. Why can't I cash it in at this moment? But Heidi and Tanya, if there's anything else either of you wanted to get in before I let you go.
Well, just everyone needs to watch the International Court of Justice is handing down its decision on provisional measures in South Africa's application in its genocide case against Israel. And so it's happening early tomorrow morning in North America, a bit later in Europe. So folks should keep an eye on that. I think, these things are not separate. When we talk about genocide, part of the Western discourse, like sort of outrage discourse machine, but also like the really concrete legal institutional edifice, a lot of work in the jurisprudential development of the concept of genocide over the last generation, so 30 or 35 years or so, has really focused on how sexual violence itself can be a modality for genocide, right? So when we kind of try to, when South Africa and the global South tries to flip the script and actually, shine light where ordinarily we're not allowed to do it, we're upending traditional or not even just traditional, but like hegemonic ideas about actually what constitutes genocide in the first place. And I think what was so helpful about Tanya's intervention just now was the, basically the description of the not mattering as a technology for continued occupation, for neo-imperialism, and for genocide as well. And so, yeah, just to kind of bring the two frames together a little bit.
Yeah, and I want to ask you, Heidi, as like a professor at a law school, one thing I'm always wondering when these things don't go the way that they should, these decisions, and it seems like international law, I mean, doesn't exist, is like, how does that, as somebody in the profession, like, is this all imaginary? And hopefully we have a good decision tomorrow and we can all be, encouraged. I'm just like, this seems like a pretty big test for international law.
Yeah, it is. It's a huge test for international. I don't want to like. A lot of people have put it forward as like kind of the litmus test for the continued relevance and existence of international law. I mean, I come to the field of international law and legal studies from a critical lens as well. So even if we get the decision, or at least a version of the decision that we want tomorrow from the ICJ, we also need to be, careful to temper our own expectations and celebratory impulses around that as well, right? So the ICJ, is the main judicial arm of the United Nations. It's not like the United Nations is some kind of like a bastion for the actual implementation of human rights, in an equal way around the world. Anything but. I just read Artie Imseis's new book, cataloging in painstaking detail, the history of the United Nations treatment of Palestine, which has been contrary to, Israeli propaganda, not to single out Israel for some kind of particularized attention or approbation. Condemnation is the word I'm looking for there, but actually to continually defer the question of Palestinian self-determination and human rights, right? So I do want to say, like, even if we get something that looks hopeful, and I think it will be meaningful for changing, the discourse, but also the diplomatic reality and what states are able to say with a straight face going forward. We need to keep in mind the way in which international law has always already been a vehicle for imperialism as well. So a healthy dose of skepticism.
Yeah, and I think that connects to a broader point about the status quo, basically, which is that one of the problems, I think, with this whole discussion is not only that it ignores violence against Palestinians, but it helps to locate October the 7th as some kind of origin point for violence in Israel and Palestine. And, and I think in a way the absolutely, the horrific violence that Israel's committed since then also risks doing that too. And I think, we need, we 100% need to be demanding, a ceasefire, an immediate end to the bombing. But we also need to say, going back to October the 6th, I mean, not that would even be possible in the short term in Gaza, but, going back to October the 6th, and to come back to what we're talking about, if you care about reducing sexual violence in this part of the world, in the world generally, then you should care about the occupation and the siege of Gaza and the conditions of secondary citizenship and it being an open-air prison, because those facilitate institutionalized sexual violence, not because Israel is particularly bad, but because conditions of ongoing oppression do. And they facilitate the kinds of sexual violence that don't matter, that we don't see, that we just kind of accept as part of the status quo. And I think, what's happened sometimes in other conflict situations is actually feminist activists have come together from different sides of the conflict to insist that, violence against women, against children, violence in conflict generally and in other conditions be opposed. And I think, if that's really what we should be pushing for.
Absolutely.
And just one final point for those interested in the ICJ right now, so the International Court of Justice. There's another issue pending before the court with respect to Israel that's not getting as much airtime right now, but goes exactly to some of the issues that Tanya just raised. In other words, there's an advisory opinion that we can expect probably sometime in the summer that's going to address the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. So that's the name of the advisory opinion that's pending, and what the court has to say about the much broader question of the occupation. And so this advisory opinion went from the General Assembly to the court, before October 7th is going to be hugely important as well. It's not just this question of provisional measures for genocide tomorrow.
Very good. Heidi, Tanya, thank you so much for your time today. We'll put a link to the piece, which is in Counterpunch, Bombing Gaza Isn't Fighting Sexual Violence. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks for having us.